Welcome to the new edition of Primus podcast, a platform that brings together policymakers and thinkers of a critical global importance for India. For today's episode, for our audience, we have Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. Needs no introduction, but a Indian representative who has headed our conversations globally as our honorable ambassador in many countries, but especially left a footprint across the Middle East, North Africa, the Levant, and region so important for India. Thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to be here. And you know, some of the questions we have already from our audience that they've mentioned to us, and let me take that as a cue to start off right away. Clearly, some geopolitical earthquakes happening across the Middle East, with conventional partners who have been playing important roles, perhaps missing from some of the scenarios. New actors who want to own the century now in play. So what is your view on what's happening in the Middle East at the moment?
Well, thank you, Mr. Sandhu, for having me with you today. The West Asia, as you know, or Middle East as called by the West, is in fact always have a very volatile geography. And it has not been volatile because of the problems intrinsic to it, but because of the geopolitics that is being played out there. We have seen since the time that these countries got liberated and the seeds of discord were there. Then the second time we had problems when firstly Israel creation that caused the Palestinian problem. And then we had the problem of Islamic Republic of Iran, where, and if you remember, that Iran and Saudi both used to be on the same side of the Americans at one time, and so were the Israelis. So since 1979, we always had these problems. And then subsequently, what happened is that the world is looking at this region, which has been really the oil provider to the world, or the wealth generation for them, has come across as a very volatile place, but a very good marketplace for weapons. Saudi Arabia is the largest importer of weapons in the world. Imagine. Iran is a nuclear country, Israel is a nuclear country. So the region, and then all these sea lanes are extremely important, as we know. Over the time, what we have seen is that the real powers like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, that prevailed for a very long time, have really lost their credibility and their virtual existence as a rule maker in the region. And then they were taken over by these Gulf countries. Now, Gulf countries were also prodded by the Americans for their own reasons, the Britishers, the French, they made bases there. So at that time, it was Cold War. So during the Cold War period, I think that the West was far more successful under the US, and the Soviet Union's problems came to the fore, and eventually they lost ground. And then when we saw that the Arab Spring, which started happening in 2010 and 11, as you know, then most of these countries took the view that there should be a regime change. So then the regime change agenda began. Of course, not that any dictators were doing anything good for their countries. And I was myself ambassador to Libya when it happened, that Gaddafi was brought down. At that time, there was all these problems happening at the grassroots, but people were generally okay with it. And then this thing continued, and we have known now what happened to Syria. Was the last bastion where the Russians got back. And then they realized that it was not happening, that their interests were not taken care of. So they continued to fight against the Western interests in Libya. And they came and physically took refuge in Syria to protect their warm sea port, which is there, which is very important for them. That's the only port they have in the sea waters. So it has again become a kind of a geopolitics. In the meantime, what we are seeing is that China very quietly, because it has been friendly with the Americans and they did not bother, through its BRI initiative and otherwise, has been able to have a tremendous footprint in the region. Virtually every country from Tehran to Tel Aviv. And they have quietly enmeshed themselves in the whole region. Now when the Americans, when this Saudi Arabia, actually I would say the prodding of the Americans, went into Yemen. Then it was the worst decision which was taken by the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and that is since 2015 has been a major problem for them. Despite the Sunni coalition of so many countries, they have not been able to win war against the Houthis. And Houthis were supported by Iran. And as you know, Iran has these 4H kind of things. The Houthis, Hamas, and the Hezbollah, they are the ones who are their arms in the region. And so the situation came where it was not moving forward. And then they realized that the American umbrella, security umbrella, was no longer working. And it was creating a very big problem for them. And China was expanding its footprints in the region much more than it could have otherwise done. And that's when we saw that the major things happened. And then the Saudis have decided that it was imperative that they should find some kind of a regional solutions to the regional problems. So basically trying to get some kind of a modus vivendi, essentially, to begin with, for which the countries which are the sane powers in the region are Omanis. They have good relations with everybody, so they tried to bring them together, both with Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Kuwaitis also worked quite closely. Iraqis, Prime Minister provided the platform for discussions between Saudis and all. But then to take the big step, and I was myself in 2019 in Beijing when China held this Middle East forum. And at that forum, nearly anyone who counted in the Arab world was present there, including the Iranians. And everybody wanted greater role for China. So it was a wake-up call, I think, for India also. It should be. But America is seen as reducing its footprint, its engagement, because it's moving towards Indo-Pacific. And that's why these countries have realized that it is not possible to bank on the West and we should do something ourselves. More importantly, US has become an energy producer itself and a competitor to the Middle East. It's no longer interested in this oil. It may want it because of the Russian aggression for the Europeans, but by itself it doesn't need it. And therefore, they wanted to develop their own policy, which is called as Act East policy. So Act East policy is China, India, and Japan, and Korea, and all those countries, which are the major consumers of the oil. And that's where their bread lies, and they're going there. So I think that this is a very good thing, rapprochement that is happening. It will have long-term impact if everybody sort of abides by the basic rules that have been agreed.
But this is very interesting because what you are laying out is a good connection between the geoeconomics and the geopolitics, and they're both feeding into each other and doing that. But thank you for reminding me of Libya, and I would like to tell our audience that thank you, Ambassador Trigunayat, for being in Libya at that time and leading one of India's largest evacuations very successfully. I was involved with that at that time from the Prime Minister's office, and I think our navies and our air forces, and you, of course, being there, that was a great learning experience, I think, for the rest of the world, that we can do operations at this scale. So I take your point. I think one of the important, if one looks back the last 60 or 70 years, the important point of great powers is not what they get for themselves. That's one part, of course. Any country will engage in its own interest. But the importance of great powers was that they allowed stability in the global scenarios, and therefore assumption of a rule-based order. And with that stability in place, countries could move forward economically, and have improvements for their populations. But if the great powers withdraw, and there is sudden withdrawal, as we have seen, Afghanistan was an example, and the points that you've laid out across Middle East, then the vacuum will create disturbances. I think that's what you're trying to bring home to our audiences, that perhaps there was a bit of a, if I would say, an abdication of great power responsibility by a number of established players, and that's leading to the kind of problems that are happening.
No, very true. In fact, if you come to think of it, a very important thing is that the liberal world order that existed post World War II, at least until the 90s, then people believed broadly, all blocs agreed that this was the right thing to do. But later on, as we have seen that once in 1990s, the United States became a hyperpower, the sole superpower, so to say. Then they started behaving in a more unilateral manner. You see, in the Middle East, the biggest mistake of all times, or mother of all mistakes, is the invasion of Iraq. When you manufactured evidence in order to invade a country because it didn't suit you. I mean, and then that's where we have seen the growth of terrorism. Firstly, they supported Taliban in the late 70s, as you know, against Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And then they go and bomb Afghanistan. And then ignominiously exit after 20 years without achieving a single objective. So this has caused that these big powers are no longer able to, especially from the West, provide you the kind of safety and security that you need. So there are two things that have happened in the region. One is that China, very similar to India, has an approach, non-interventionist, non-prescriptive approaches. You have what kind of a leader, because most of them are these sort of sheikdoms and monarchies. Whether nobody talks about human rights, nobody talks about democracy, they deal with them, work with them. That's what China does. So that's why China is more acceptable there. India also in the same way, apart from the historic connect that we have with them. On the other hand, these Western countries use their old stunted tools, which create, in my view, a little more negativity than any positive outcomes. I mean, if a country which says that world should be ruled by a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or anywhere else. ICC is another example. And I asked this question 2 days back in a conference. I said, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, signed in 82. This is kind of a constitution of the seas. If the hyperpower does not recognize it, how can you enforce the order on the maritime? China does not abide by it. So the two superpowers today in the region are not adhering to the basic principles. And that is a very big problem that these countries, every other country which is facing. And that's why what you have seen in the Russia-Ukraine war is that more and more countries are taking autonomous positions. You may call it a strategic autonomy, choices they are making. They refuse to be part of the sanctions against Russia. They are continuing to do business with Russia, whether under OPEC Plus or otherwise. So what we are looking at is emergence. I mean, unfortunately, I hope I'm proved wrong. The world is heading towards a Cold War 2.0 kind of scenario. Now, if that happens, then what happens to all these countries? They're friendly with everybody, minilaterals, multilaterals, and everything. But when there is a coalition that will take place of the Cold War 2.0, then I see for India a role as a leader for the nations for strategic autonomy. And at that time, very many powerful countries will be there. But this will depend on us if we want to take that jump and the lead and provide the kind of leadership that we did for 50, 60 years ago.
No, that's interesting, because you say that there is a vacuum and perhaps India can play a bigger role within that vacuum. But let me also point out to you that there's a very large, we don't call it a global power in the sense, but if you look at EU, I think the EU has always been punching below its weight. I have always been talking to colleagues from Europe and saying that, why can't you have a coordinated foreign policy? I mean, at the end of the day, you are the United States of Europe. I mean, that's the way you need to look at yourself. And I think part of the problem comes, whether it is Ukraine or other decisions, is because Europe is not behaving as a bloc. I think that is also a vacuum that's existing in the system that, in the global system, that there is a very strong economic interest. If you see the whole of Europe, they are large economies, they are large technology holders, they are the frontiers of technological research in many areas. But I think they continue to punch below their weight. And in that sense, is this building relationship between India and EU, you think something that can be brought together and perhaps stabilize the Middle East, for example, in some measure?
Well, I think that the Middle East currently, if you come to think of it, the rapprochement that is happening among themselves, that means they are reducing the trust deficit to some extent through their bilateral and internal regional matters. For admission of Syria back into the Arab League, Saudi Arabia and Egypt and UAE investing and talking to Turkey, which was their competitor for Islamic influence and others. Saudi Arabia and Iran moving forward diplomatic relations, Turkey and Israel moving ahead, Egypt and Israel doing everything. Even though the main problem that will remain in the region is the Palestinian issue, which can bite at any time, despite the Abraham Accords that happened, or the I2U2s of today's, or the IUSU as I call is India, US and Saudi Arabia and UAE. So all these multilaterals have a limited value to some extent. And that is one way that India has started showing itself that it can work together. Where USA is a common, UAE is a common, India are common, both sides of this. But European Union, you are very right, the European Union did not have a focused policy. It do not even have today. What is happening is France has some bases in the region. These Germans have something else because they were not dependent on the Middle East oil so much. They were more colluding with the Russians all along. They had the pipelines and whatnot and all. But during this war, they have realized that they need to find alternates. But while they are realizing that they are finding the alternates, I think that the Middle East per se is looking more towards China and India. So we should try to work with any like-minded partner, as we say that France is our Russia and Europe in terms of our activities or our trust that we have with these countries. So we have much closer relationship with France than many other countries. Plus, European Union has its own fissures, as you have rightly mentioned. Germany has its own game plan vis-a-vis China. So who are we trying to control in the region? China is way ahead than any other country today. It's a reality. I mean, it has nothing to do with you feeling patriotic or not, but the fact is fact. China is today in a position to bring countries, and they also offer to do something about Israel-Palestine. They are working on the Russia-Ukraine war. So they are showing that we are the bridge builders, that we can create confidence, we can provide a platform. That's something I always say that we could have done ourselves because our Prime Minister can talk to anybody. He has tremendous appeal in the world. India is a rising power, and we need to take on those responsibilities going forward.
So, absolutely agree. I mean, if we see the sort of center of gravity of the world shifting in this century, is shifting towards Asia and India and China, of course, being the major players. And the acceptance of the fact is that at this moment, the table is adversarial. So how do you see this moving forward? Clearly, a large part of the world looking at both these countries, and these countries at the moment not being able to talk to each other as they would like to. So what is your thought on how to take this, this whole thing forward between the two countries itself?
Well, as far as my understanding is that China is going to be our challenge in every geography. There is no denying the fact. Chinese may be 5 times bigger than our economy, bigger military power, technologically way too advanced. Despite the fact the Chinese only feel that if at all they can be threatened because of the economic growth, because of the way we have been able to put together ourselves, is India, frankly. And they only take solace in something that India has its autonomous foreign policy. That's what China feels good about. They have often said it also. We have followed a policy of competition with cooperation with China. We also know we can't live without them. They are also the largest trading partner. It's a neighborhood. As I always say that neighbors are a gift of geography, but pains of history. So this is something we are going to deal with them. But fact that they are not able to respect any rules, regulations, laws, and tries to use this grey zone warfare, disinformation warfare against India. So we are going to have a problem in times, even in the Middle East, let alone this. Although we have great relations today, relations in India have moved from transactional to strategic partnership with major countries in the region. But despite that, those countries don't want to choose between India and China. Until recently, they did not want to choose between India and Pakistan. But that is something we have neutralized to a great extent. But at the same time, they don't want to choose between India and China. They would rather that India and China work together. In the near future, though, I do not see a great bonhomie between India and China until dramatically China changes its tricks, which is very unlikely, because China wants to keep India within the South Asian periphery and not become a global power.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, in nations, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. So your neighbors are already there, and that's one hopes. And I'm reminded of I think it was 2010 or 2011 communique that came out of a joint communique between India and China that came out of Hyderabad House at the head of government level. And there's a statement in that. It says that the global economy has space enough for both the growth ambitions of India and China. And I think that was a very targeted statement to allay any fears within the Chinese establishment that the growth of India poses any threat to China. I think that statement still holds. The global economy is large enough. India and China can still work together and without disturbing each other strategically. And as you said, let's hope platforms do get created where that happens. But at this moment, you see that this is an uphill task, agreed. So let's shift to the other neighbor. Interesting things happening across the border. India has seen this many times in Pakistan, all kind of forces at play, the army, the political establishment. This time it seems that the courts are a little more active. So what's your view about the other neighbor?
Well, I feel sorry for the people of Pakistan. They have been always shortchanged. The country did not have democracy even worth this name. Army, which is also an economic power in the country, they hold the maximum economic strengths in the country and industries. They have always succeeded in controlling the political spectrum in the country, irrespective. Most of the time they have ruled directly, but now that they are not ruling, still they are ruling, as we have seen in Imran Khan's removal. But what you are seeing now is that the people of Pakistan, or at least the Pakistani Tehreek-e-Taliban, the PTI, they are actually going after the army and attacking the army. This was unheard of. It never was seen in Pakistan. And therefore, I think that there is some paradigm shift that is taking place in the country. Imran Khan may not survive this whole thing because army eventually wins. But then army will have to change its tracks. And as far as India is concerned, there is a zero-sum game. The army, and especially more than the army, the ISI, derives its relevance by going against India for everything. And today they have found an ironclad partner in China. So I say it, and I shouldn't as a diplomat be saying, but Pakistan has actually become a province of China for all practical purposes. And they are able to dictate and hurt India through Pakistan. How I say that? Terrorism is an instrument of Pakistan's foreign policy, right? It continues unabated, despite all kinds of agreements. But when you look at the designating the global terrorists in the United Nations Security Council 1260 or T7 committee, China is the one which comes with technical hold, one after the other, again and again and again, what's indirectly supporting terrorism and indirectly supporting the state of Pakistan. They become part of it. Likewise, in Afghanistan, they wanted to keep us out. Afghans are waking up to that reality now because Afghans have always been independent people, despite their difficulties. So Pakistan's, I think that the future is not bright. It has been a failed state for quite some time now, but now people have to bail it out. But we always believed, and India's policy has always been, that a strong Pakistan and a economically strong neighborhood, all neighboring countries, are good for India. And it's logical. But today we don't see that.
But anyway, that's a good note for me to take away from our conversation, Ambassador Trigunayat. Yes, it's a bit of a disturbed world. It's changing. We have two difficult neighbors. But I think the fact that we are growing, we are young, we have an urge to not make war with anybody, but we are quite clear that we don't want to be messed with by anybody, and that we will continue to have our growth and continue to make our presence felt in the world. So I think these are some very good takeaways I take away. And I think the audiences are also clear about the red flags that you've raised. But along with that, the paths that we are charting out ourselves as a nation is full of a lot of hope for us. Thank you so much for coming today and sharing your thoughts with Primus Podcast. We look forward to another episode from you shortly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.